Infidelity doesn't always begin with passion. Sometimes it starts with a question that seems harmless. We tell stories that are neither new nor ever truly old. Not to judge, not to justify, but to remind that infidelity isn't always betrayal. Sometimes, it's simply the longing to feel alive. Once more. He is Captain Matthew Carter, 42 years old, a Marine who served nearly 20 years, with a wife and 2 sons in suburban Columbus, Ohio. He fits the classic soldier mold. 6 feet 1 inch tall, solid build, chiseled features, close-cropped hair, and deep blue eyes that have seen more than they should. In the military, he was respected by his comrades. But in his marriage, he was always absent. For nearly 3 years, he was continuously deployed on overseas missions. His most recent return was due to an unexpected explosion during a mission in Kandahar that left his left leg severely injured. No longer fit for combat, he was transferred for long-term treatment at Brooke Army Medical Center in San Antonio, Texas, so far away that his family could only see him through a screen. His wife, Natalie, 40 years old, once his first love, now a primary school teacher, managed the household and their 2 boys alone. Their calls grew shorter, regular yet cold. There were no arguments, but no "I love you" either. The distance between them was filled with duty, no longer with emotion. She is Olivia Ramos, 39 years old, head nurse in the rehabilitation unit for wounded soldiers. Born and raised in San Antonio, of Mexican descent, Olivia had a soft, feminine figure with gentle shoulders, sun-kissed skin, and warm brown eyes. Once the beauty queen of her nursing school, Olivia stood out not only for her looks but for her calm and warmth in every gesture. The scent of lavender and freshly washed linens lingered in her hair, comforting, familiar, and making people want to linger just a little longer. Olivia was also married to a local police officer, but their marriage had grown cold after years of living side by side without being truly together. They slept in the same bed but turned their backs on each other. She cared for hundreds of patients, yet when she came home, she felt like a ghost. Brooke Army Medical Center was unlike ordinary civilian hospitals. It was a place where the sounds were not just hospital beds rolling or heart monitors beeping, but also the silence of dreams interrupted. Matthew was assigned to the rehabilitation unit for soldiers injured in combat, where long sunlit hallways carried the scent of antiseptic mixed with dried sweat and the faint scorch of old uniforms. Here, days passed with military precision. 6 a.m. physical check, 8 a.m. therapy, 10 a.m. recovery counseling, 2 p.m. physical rehabilitation. Everything happened like clockwork or not a minute out of place. But there were small, quiet moments that weren't in the schedule, like when Olivia gently placed a hand on his shoulder to help adjust his crutch, or when she pulled the curtains so the sunlight wouldn't shine directly on his face, softly, carefully, as if he wasn't just a patient. Matthew's room was on the 3rd floor, south wing of the hospital, overlooking a lawn where military flags waved in the breeze. Inside, everything was neatly arranged. A single bed with white linens, a small folding table, a wall covered with notes tracking his rehabilitation schedule. But the most special corner was a small photo frame on the shelf, a picture of Natalie and their 2 sons smiling brightly next to last year's Christmas tree. A father, a husband, but also a man learning to live again with wounds, both physical and emotional. Olivia was the head nurse in charge of the rehabilitation unit, always busy, always efficient. But with Matthew, she slowed down, just a little. She was the only one who patiently sat beside him when he was silent. The only one who didn't ask, "How do you feel?" but instead quietly handed him a hot cup of coffee and a smile, as if to say, "You don't have to speak. I understand." And in those moments, amidst the routines of duty and recovery, the sound of footsteps in the hallways, and the soft rustle of bed sheets when turning over, something different began to bloom. That day was a Friday. The South Texas sun spilled through the 3rd floor treatment room windows, casting a soft streak of light on the cold stone floor. Matthew was trying to walk again after rounds of high-intensity therapy. Each step came with the heavy sound of his crutch tapping the ground, thud, thud. Olivia walked beside him, holding a clipboard tracking his progress. She wore a white coat over navy blue scrubs, her hair in a high bun. A few dark curls escaped, glimmering in the sunlight like silken threads. "You went farther today," she said softly, like a summer breeze. "Must be the motivation." "From this morning's coffee," Matthew replied, half joking. She smiled, the way her lips curved, unforced, unprofessional, real. As they neared the hallway window, Olivia paused, facing him. "Let me fix your knee brace." It slipped a bit. She knelt down, her small hands gently adjusting the brace on his leg, where the thin khaki fabric of his uniform did little to dull the sensation. Her fingers were cool, moving carefully, yet still making his heart skip a beat. A breeze drifted through the slightly open window. The air suddenly felt fragile, as if a single breath could shatter it. Matthew looked down, and for the first time their eyes met and held. No words, no actions crossing any lines, just a gaze. But that gaze made him feel seen, truly seen, behind the uniform, behind the role of husband, father, soldier. And for Olivia, that moment was when she realized this man wasn't just a patient. He was someone who made her tread carefully around the rhythm of her own heart. 3 weeks after their first meeting under the Texas afternoon sun, Matthew transitioned to an intensive rehabilitation phase, physical therapy combined with psychological counseling. Olivia, at the request of the head doctor and Matthew himself, was assigned to closely monitor his recovery. At first, it was just morning and afternoon checkups. But gradually, she started spending more time in the rehab room, and not entirely because of duty, but because of the conversations between two people who had endured so much, yet found common ground in their unspoken wounds. One afternoon, Matthew was tasked with a balance exercise using a resistance band. Olivia stood behind him, placing her hands gently on his hips to steady him if he faltered. His shirt clung to his back, damp with sweat. The scent of military soap mixed with his natural musk, strong, rugged, intoxicating, making her heart race. "Balance is tough," Matthew joked, "especially with a woman's hands on your waist." "I'm just doing my job," Olivia shot back quickly, but the shy smile on her blushing cheeks betrayed her. Among the hum of machines and the squeak of rubber soles on the floor, his deep chuckle filled the room, warming the air between them. No one said it out loud, but they both knew. The fragile line between professionalism and emotion was beginning to blur. When the exercise ended, Olivia bent down to pick up a towel, and her hand brushed against his. This time, neither of them pulled away. A fleeting touch, yet enough to linger far longer than either expected. That night, the recovery ward was unusually quiet. The distant sound of guards' footsteps echoed faintly down the corridors, and the cold neon lights cast a pale glow over Olivia's tired but composed face. Matthew couldn't sleep. The pain in his left leg kept him restless. Or maybe it wasn't just the pain. Still awake, his voice, low and raspy, broke the silence as she passed his room. Olivia stopped, leaning against the doorframe. "On shift. Besides, I'm used to nights like these." "Funny?" Matthew stared at the ceiling, his voice barely more than a whisper. "There were nights on the front lines when I wished I could hear heels clicking instead of gunfire. But now that I do, I still can't sleep." She smiled softly, stepping inside and quietly shutting the door behind her. Sitting down beside his bed, she looked at him, a soldier with a hardened body but eyes heavy with sorrow. "As for me, there were nights I wished I could hear someone telling a story, instead of the beeping of heart monitors." A long silence followed. The room seemed to shrink around the sound of their slow breaths, the faint beeping of machines, and the feeling of being heard. "You're married, aren't you?" she asked quietly. "Yeah, 15 years. She's strong, independent, resilient. But sometimes, it feels like we're two soldiers fighting different battles." Olivia didn't reply. She just looked at him, long and deep. "And you?" he asked, his gaze never leaving hers. "Married, and we have a 10-year-old son. But sometimes, I feel like a stranger in my own home. They need me out of habit. Not as a woman who still dreams." They didn't touch. But the words, fragile as they were, drew them closer than any physical contact could. And in that hospital room, amidst war wounds and sleepless nights, they understood. They were no longer alone. The 32nd night after his surgery. Light rain tapped softly against the window, the wind slipping through the cracks, whispering like a quiet breath in the dark. Matthew sat in his wheelchair, a worn notebook in his hands, trying to write down pieces of his battlefield memories for his son. His left hand was still weak from the shoulder injury, each stroke of the pen a quiet struggle. The door creaked open. Olivia entered, her white coat faintly carrying the sterile scent of disinfectant. But in the dim light, her natural fragrance, a soft blend of flowers and fresh linens, gently overpowered it. "Writing again? Can't you take a break?" she asked, approaching him. "I want to remember everything, every man who didn't make it back. I lived. I have to remember. You're alive, but you don't have to carry it all alone." Her hand rested softly on his shoulder, a touch that wasn't part of her professional duties, but entirely human. Matthew turned to face her. Their eyes met, longer than usual, deeper than politeness, quieter than words. Outside, the rain fell harder. Inside, Olivia reached down to button his shirt. One had come undone when he leaned forward. Her fingers brushed his tan skin, feeling the faint ripple of muscles beneath the thin fabric. She paused, as if she'd crossed into forbidden territory. He held his breath, as if he'd stepped into an unknown emotion. "Thank you," he whispered. "For what?" Her voice was soft, almost drowned by the rain. "For not running away." She didn't answer. She just held his hand. Briefly, but enough to warm the cold, lonely night. A spring storm swept through Georgia, plunging the clinical wing into darkness. The backup generator hummed weakly, casting flickering shadows across the walls, trembling like the unspoken feelings stirring inside them. Matthew couldn't sleep. The pain returned with the changing weather, pulling him to the hallway where he leaned against the cold wall. The window was slightly ajar, allowing the sound of rustling leaves and the chill of rain to seep through. A white silhouette hurried past. It was Olivia holding a medical kit, her high ponytail slightly disheveled from the dampness, lips dry, but her eyes still bright, like a light flickering in the dark. "You shouldn't be out here," she said, slightly out of breath. "I know," he replied softly, "but being alone in a dark room makes me feel like I've already died." She didn't answer, just set the medical kit down and sat beside him. They were close, so close that Matthew could hear her heartbeat. Suddenly, a flash of lightning sliced through the sky, illuminating the corridor for a brief moment before plunging back into darkness. Startled, she instinctively reached out and touched his hand. He didn't pull away. They sat like that for a long time. No words were spoken, yet emotions spilled over, like the sky outside no longer able to hold back the rain. "If you weren't my patient," she whispered, barely audible. He turned to look at her. For a long moment. "If you weren't married." The wind blew harder. The window rattled softly. But in that corridor, two people who had survived war, marriage, and duty now faced a new battle. A battle of emotions, silent and weaponless, and neither could win. After the stormy night, Matthew was moved to a solitary therapy room at the end of the hall, a quiet area, almost secluded from the rest of the hospital. Only Olivia was assigned to his care. That morning, the first light of day filtered through the frosted window, casting a soft golden hue on the white sheets. Olivia entered, carrying a tray of medicine, her hair neatly tied back, and the familiar gentle scent of lavender lingering in the air. No perfume, just the simple fragrance of the shampoo middle-aged women often use, tender, warm, and real. "How are you feeling today?" she asked, her voice softer than usual. "Not as much pain as yesterday, but uncomfortable in a different way." He looked at her, his gaze unhidden. Olivia leaned down to check his stitches. The distance between them shrank to just a few inches. He felt her breath against his skin, and his chest tightened involuntarily. Her hand rested on the newly healed scar. cool, soft, and slightly trembling. He whispered, "Olivia, you don't have to be so gentle." She looked up. Their eyes met. Nothing was intentional, yet nothing was entirely unconscious. They stood there, too close to be doctor and patient, yet still too far to be lovers. Then he reached out, gently tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. She didn't pull away, didn't withdraw her hand, didn't say anything, just a touch. But in that moment, every wall crumbled. The room grew too quiet. Only the slow whir of the ceiling fan remained, and the sound of hearts beating too fast. That moment didn't last long, but it was enough to change everything between them. The following week, Olivia requested to continue her night shifts in the recovery ward, where Matthew was still being treated. She cited familiarity with the patient, making it easier to monitor his condition. No one questioned her. Olivia's dedication had never been doubted. Every night, she entered his room at 9 p.m., brought his medication, checked his stitches, gently wiped his body, and shared small stories about her husband, a tax officer, quiet, loving his family but never saying he loved his wife. About her son, already graduated from college, but rarely calling his mother. And about the dreams she buried when she turned 30. Matthew, in turn, spoke about his wife, a high school teacher in Nebraska. Gentle, patient, yet somehow they had forgotten how to make each other feel alive. They were both faithful in the sense that they never cheated. But for a long time, they hadn't touched each other like lovers. One night, Matthew woke from pain. He called Olivia's name. She came to him, sat by his side, and held his hand. Cold, but it warmed in hers. They said nothing, but he saw it in her eyes, a loneliness shimmering like a single droplet caught at the bottom of her heart. "You shouldn't see me like this," Olivia whispered, her voice raw with suppressed emotions. Matthew responded with a gentle squeeze of her hand, light, but real. And in that moment he knew he had crossed a line, not because of physical touch, but because he needed her in the way a man only needs someone who makes his heart come alive again. That night he couldn't sleep, because for the first time in years, his heart raced not from physical pain, but because of a woman who wasn't his wife. After Olivia had cared for him night after night, a quiet familiarity grew between them, not from flirtation, but from the unspoken silences. That evening, heavy rain poured outside. The bed next to his was empty, as the patient had been discharged early. The room felt unusually quiet. Matthew leaned against the headboard, staring vaguely at the rain outside the window. His arm still ached, but tonight, what troubled him most wasn't the wound. Olivia entered, carrying a tray of medicine and some fruit. Her hair fell loosely around her face, a few curls damp from the rain, the scent of lavender drifting through the air, awakening something deep inside him. "You're soaked," he whispered, his voice husky. "It's fine. I'm used to it," she smiled, placing the tray on the table. "And you? Why do you seem so sad tonight?" He stayed silent, just looked at her, for a long time. Then suddenly he said, "How long? Has it been since someone asked you that?" The question made Olivia freeze. A long silence followed. "It's been so long," she replied slowly. "My husband is a good man, but it seems he has forgotten that I am a woman." Matthew nodded slightly, as if hearing his own thoughts spoken aloud. "Me too. For years I've been a good husband, proper father, but I'm no longer a man in my wife's eyes." Their eyes met, not intense, not loud, but filled with a profound empathy of two grown souls, each bearing their wounds, and now finding each other not for love, but for understanding. Olivia stepped closer, gently resting her hand on his shoulder. "Are you cold?" "No, but I've forgotten what it feels like to be touched, without it being out of duty." There was no kiss, no confession of love. But in that moment, as Olivia softly leaned her head against his shoulder, they both knew the walls within them had begun to melt. Matthew had grown accustomed to the pain in his body, but the ache in his chest, every time he watched Olivia walk away, every time he heard her voice speaking to another patient, was what truly made him feel unbearable. They began to find excuses to see each other more often. Olivia lingered after her shifts, and Matthew always woke just as she entered his room at dawn. During bandage changes, he let her touch linger longer than necessary. She no longer avoided his gaze as she once did. Then one night, the hospital lost power after a fierce storm. The dim hallways flickered with emergency lights. Matthew was being transferred to another room for examination, and Olivia volunteered to go with him in case he needed anything. The elevator came to an abrupt stop between floors. The faint red glow of the emergency light cast shadows across the confined space. Their breaths drew close enough that Matthew could smell the lavender scent from her blouse. She braced herself against the elevator wall to keep steady. The space between them shrank to mere inches. He looked down where her collar opened slightly, revealing smooth, pale skin glistening with sweat. A single droplet trailed down her collarbone. "Are you cold?" Matthew asked, his voice lower than usual. "No," Olivia replied, eyes never leaving his. "It's just..." She didn't finish her sentence, because at that very moment, he reached out, gently tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His hand lingered on her cheek, and he didn't pull away. In that instant, it felt as if both of them stepped out of their own skins. Olivia tilted her face ever so slightly, just enough for her lips to brush the back of his hand. Matthew's chest tightened. He slid his hand to the nape of her neck, pulling her closer, closer still. Their lips found each other not in haste, not in hunger but tenderly, as if they both understood. Once they crossed this line, there would be no turning back. She whimpered softly as he tightened his arms around her, as if every buried pain within them had found a place to be released. The hum of the elevator continued faintly, but for them, time stood still. Their lips parted, and they stood silently. Breaths quickened, bodies flushed. Neither spoke. Only Olivia's eyes, a mix of panic and longing, had never been clearer. After that night in the elevator, Matthew was moved to a private room, a privilege for veterans who had served in special operations. And Olivia remained his primary nurse. From then on, something unspoken lingered between them, but they both felt it clearly. They had entered forbidden territory. One quiet weekend night, the hospital was nearly empty. Rain tapped softly against the window pane. Olivia brought his medicine later than usual. The soft yellow light cast a strange tenderness across her face. She sat by his bed, checking his temperature, his pulse. "I tried to stay away, but I can't," she whispered, her hand still wrapped around his wrist, counting his pulse. Matthew looked at her, silent. Then he reached out, softly running his fingers through her hair, trailing down the nape of her neck. Her skin was warm, soft. Olivia closed her eyes, exhaling quietly. "We shouldn't," she murmured. But the next moment, it was she who leaned down, kissing him. The kiss was no longer hesitant like in the elevator. It was fierce, fervent, as if she had been holding back for far too long. He pulled her onto the bed. The wounds in his abdomen still ached, but he ignored them. The hands that once held weapons now fumbled with the buttons of her blouse, slow, careful, as if afraid of breaking something sacred. Silk whispered against the floor. The scent from her hair, hints of bergamot and a touch of vanilla, filled the air. She straddled him, arms around his neck, whispering in broken breaths. "I don't want to think about tomorrow." His hand trailed down her spine. She arched against him, gasping softly when his lips found her shoulder. The sound was quiet, but it echoed through the silent room. Lips met lips, skin against skin, ragged breaths, the soft sinking of pillows, blankets pushed aside. In that dimly lit hospital room, two wounded souls sought refuge, not in words, but in touch. In that quiet hospital room, where only hours ago there had been nothing but the hush of needles and the steady beep of machines, there was now the sound of hurried breaths, soft gasps, as if both were finally quenching a thirst that had been suppressed for far too long. Olivia lay curled against Matthew, her white blouse draped carelessly over the chair. The faint light from the window traced the curve of her skin, smooth and flushed. Matthew's hand glided from the curve of her waist to the small of her back, feeling every breath, every subtle shiver. He leaned down, kissing along her collarbone, where her scent lingered strongest, intoxicating him to the brink of losing control. "Matt!" She whispered his name in a soft moan, her voice trembling, delicate as morning dew. The bed sheets were rumpled, the sound of pillows shifting with each movement of their bodies, the creak of his back against the bed frame, the sound of skin meeting skin, damp, urgent, and wild. Every time he gripped her hips, every deliberate thrust, she let out a soft moan, restrained, helpless, not loud, but full of yearning. She clung to his neck, whispering, "Don't stop, please." Outside, the rain pattered against the window. Inside, only the sound of ragged breaths and intertwined whispers remained. He murmured into her ear, voice husky, "I shouldn't be doing this." "Me neither. But I don't regret it." In that final moment, they held each other tight. Whispers turned into cries of passion. No longer nurse and soldier, just two broken souls, momentarily forgetting their pain, finding each other in the most primal of sounds. The next morning, sunlight poured through the window of the military hospital room, illuminating a space that had witnessed a sleepless night. Matthew sat at the edge of the bed, hands resting on his thighs, eyes staring into nothing. The sheets had been pulled straight, clean, as if nothing had happened. Yet the scent of last night lingered in the air, faint, clinging to his skin and the collar of his shirt, where Olivia's perfume still lingered. His hand trembled as he picked up his phone, seeing 3 missed calls from his wife. The message was short. "The kids and I tried calling before bed. It's okay. Sleep well, Matt." His throat tightened. Through years of combat, he had lain among explosions, watched comrades fall, but he had never felt like the bad guy. Until now. Olivia stepped out of the bathroom, hair still damp, face bare yet heartbreakingly beautiful. Her eyes met his, not with regret, but with confusion. "I don't know how to say good morning to you today," she whispered, gripping her towel. He didn't answer, just turned away. They both understood that what had happened could no longer be denied. It wasn't just the ambiguity of emotions or the sharing of sorrow. It was real, physical, betrayal. A young nurse pushed a medication cart past the room, glancing inside before moving on. Matthew flinched. His heart pounded, not from desire, but fear. He feared that glance had seen too much. He feared rumors. He feared everything unraveling, not because of military honor, but because he couldn't bear the thought of his daughter looking at him one day, seeing a man who betrayed her mother. He turned to Olivia, voice low. "We have to stop." She let out a soft, bitter laugh. "You think it's that easy?" They stared at each other for a long time. In daylight, everything was clearer. Their faces, their bodies, their mistakes, and what they stood to lose if anyone found out. And they both understood. The truth was never easy to face. That day, the air in the ward felt heavier. The afternoon sunlight sliced through the window, casting jagged beams across the floor, as if reminding them. Some things cannot stay hidden forever. Matthew sat in physical therapy, left leg still relying on crutches. He heard Lieutenant Colonel Bowman's voice down the hallway, a brief conversation, but Olivia's name was mentioned, clear and tense. An hour later, she appeared at his door. The white blouse was gone, replaced by a navy blue top hugging her figure and simple jeans. Her eyes were slightly swollen, no makeup. The familiar scent of lavender still lingered with every step, but today, something felt different. "We were reported," she said softly, standing straight, voice quiet but firm. "Who? Maybe another patient, or one of the other nurses. They've been watching us for a while now." Matthew gripped his crutch, standing up, forcing himself to stay calm. "I'll take the blame," he said. It started with me." Olivia shook her head. "No, Matt. We both stepped into this together, but now you have to choose." She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out an old photograph. His family. Emma, his wife, in a light green dress, holding hands with their 2 kids, smiling in front of their Texas home. You still have a chance to go back. Your family is waiting for you. As for me, I just put in a transfer request to the surgical ward. We won't be working the same shifts anymore. The words dropped between them like the soft crack of something breaking. No drama, no tears, but heavy like a chapter closing. Matthew looked at the photo, then back at Olivia. In her eyes, he saw a year of warmth, stolen glances in bright hallways, hands brushing against each other during long shifts. But he also saw the line they both knew they had crossed. "I don't know how to go back," he whispered. "Then learn, because your kids deserve a father who isn't broken." She left the room. The faint trace of her perfume lingered, but this time it didn't make him ache with longing, only regret, like a soldier who survived a battle but lost a part of himself. That night, the hospital room felt bigger than usual. Matthew lay in the dim light, the family photo resting on his chest, a reminder, or maybe a sentence. He hadn't called Emma in 2 days, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he wasn't sure anymore who he was. Outside, the hospital intercom echoed, announcing the shift change. Each sound had once been the rhythm of Matthew's life for over a year, the place where he had bonded, recovered, and loved. And now, it was the place he had to forget. On the table, Olivia's letter lay neatly folded. The paper was wrinkled, its corners damp with the sweat of his hands since that afternoon. He had read it so many times he knew every word by heart. "Matt, thank you for making me feel loved after so many years of knowing only duty and responsibility. But I can't be the reason your family falls apart. I chose to leave first so you would have a chance to go back. Be strong like a soldier and like a good man. Olivia." He folded the letter again, squeezing it tightly. In his mind, Olivia's image appeared, not in the moments of passion, but when she applied ointment to his leg in the dead of night, her hands cold but her heart so warm. He wondered, was it love, or just 2 lonely souls clinging to each other to keep from falling apart? In the most brutal battle of his life, no bombs, no clear enemy, Matthew had to ask himself, who will I live with, and who will I live as? The next morning he called Emma. Her voice was surprised, then overwhelmed with joy. But as his daughter's chatter filled the phone, Matthew could only stare out the window, where Olivia once stood every afternoon on her shift, and feel something inside him dying so that the rest could keep living. Matthew returned to the physical therapy room, the place where the feelings he dared not name had begun. Olivia was no longer there. Her shifts had changed permanently to another ward. And since the afternoon he received her letter, they hadn't crossed paths. But Matthew still saw her everywhere. In the lingering scent in the hallway, in the misplaced coffee cup, in the pain in his left leg each time he pushed himself further, because she once said, "I want to see you walk out of here on your own 2 feet. On sleepless nights, Matthew stared at the family photo. Emma, his wife, smiling softly, kindly, safely. But it was that same smile he had seen for 17 years. Beautiful but familiar. Loved, but no longer making his heart skip a beat. Matthew began keeping a journal. Not for anyone to read, just to separate the 2 men living inside him. The soldier, loyal, responsible, knowing the boundaries of right and wrong. The man, wounded, lonely, yearning to be touched and understood through a gaze. No words needed. He wondered, how long had it been since he last held Emma's hand while sleeping? Since he touched her back, looked at her as a woman rather than the mother of his children? And Olivia, the nurse 8 years younger, was the one who made those questions rise. Not because she was more beautiful than Emma, not because she was new, but because with her Matthew felt alive, needed, still a man, not just a symbol. He once thought duty was the armor that kept him from straying, but now it felt more like a shackle, holding him in place among things long dead, bound by the word responsibility. And in the dark hospital room, with only the ticking clock, Matthew quietly asked himself, how many people have lived correctly, but not truthfully? Monday morning, sunlight streamed through the small hospital window. Matthew sat on the bed, crutches leaning against the wall, gaze distant. He had just signed his discharge papers. The recovery phase was ending. That meant he had to leave this place. Leave Olivia. No formal goodbyes. No final embrace. Only a small piece of paper she left in the nightstand drawer with a single line. I know you will choose what's right, and I'm proud to have been a small part of that journey. Matthew folded the note, placed it close to his heart, then stood, slowly, painfully, but resolutely. On his way to the hospital gate, he saw Olivia in the distance, pushing a medicine cart for another patient. They didn't call each other's names. Only eyes met, silent, but full. She didn't cry. He didn't smile. Just a nod, slight, but enough for them both to understand. They had once crossed the limits of reason, and now they were returning with all the strength of grown adults. The military vehicle waited outside the gate. Matthew climbed in, looked back one last time. In his heart, a new scar formed, not from the battlefield, but from love. But he knew he had made his choice, not to forget, but to move forward. With that memory, with gratitude, and with a part of himself Olivia had awakened, forever. 2 months after leaving the hospital, Matthew returned to his unit, for the first time in years on unsteady legs, but with eyes more determined than ever. Family life remained unchanged. Sarah, his wife, gentle, devoted, never asked a single question about the gaps in time he spent at the hospital. She seemed to sense something, but chose silence, as if she knew some things, if spoken, would only deepen the pain. One chilly autumn afternoon, while rummaging through his old hospital bag, a small folded note slipped out. It was Olivia's words, still intact like the emotions inside him. He held the note, staring out the window. Far off, the mountain range faded in the pale sunlight, the place where he once fought and once loved, a love incomplete, but deep enough to never forget. That evening, he took his wife and children for a walk. He held Sarah's hand gently but firmly. She looked at him, surprised, then smiled softly. He said nothing, but for the first time, after years of distance, there was something in his gaze that made her feel at peace. In another state, in a small apartment in Denver, Olivia sat by the window, listening to an old song. Can't help falling in love. The melody was as light as a touch, yet it made the heart sink. She glanced at the clock. 7:12 p.m. No messages, no calls, just a fleeting moment, like waiting for something that would never happen again. She closed her eyes, fingers gently tracing her neck, the place where he once left a soft kiss. Then she smiled, a bitter smile but without regret. That love story didn't end with a goodbye, but with growth. They once belonged to each other, only not at the right time, not in the right circumstances. And now they moved on, not together, but each carried a piece of the other, tucked away in the deepest corners of memory. That winter, the first snowfall blanketed the old base, where Matthew had once been stationed. He was on a short assignment there, his first time back since the injury. Everything felt familiar yet distant. On his last afternoon before leaving, he stopped by the small cafe behind the chapel, the place where he and Olivia once sat together, while rain poured over the empty courtyard outside. The cafe door still carried the small wind chime, softly tinkling whenever someone entered. The scent of cinnamon and vanilla lingered in the air, making his heart pause for a beat. He chose the table at the far corner, the same spot where she once tilted her head and smiled, asking if he liked his coffee with a little milk. On the table, the glass jar of dried flowers remained. But this time, no one sat across from him. Just a steaming cup of coffee and the afternoon light streaming through the window. He opened his wallet and slowly pulled out a faded photo, taken at the medal ceremony back at the hospital. She stood beside him in her white coat, hands resting on his shoulder. On the back of the photo, a single line written in purple ink. Not yours, but always someone who cared deeply. At that very moment, in Denver, Olivia was sorting through old books. An envelope slipped out from her worn nurse's notebook, a letter never sent. She stared at her own handwriting, shook her head softly, then placed it back, unopened. Outside the window, snow fell gently. In that fleeting instant, she smiled. Not because she was happy, but because once, for a brief time, her heart had lived. Without hesitation, without fear, just love. Soft as the wind passing by, but enough to remember forever.